What's up everyone, it's the Law School Lumberjack here again with another video. Today I'm going to be giving a general framework on how to approach logic games questions. Now in future videos I will be going into greater detail on the game types and how to approach the questions for each of the games in more of a targeted fashion, but I thought for this video, as more of an introductory video, I thought I would provide a general framework that I've created for how to approach any game in the logic game section. So step number one, and I know this may sound silly, but read the question carefully. Make sure that you note the number of variables, and also make sure that you note any sort of thing that's stated in the question that may help you moving forward. So for example, if there's 9 people and they say that only 6 people are going to be chosen, that's important to keep in mind. The reason being is that in the back of your mind, you can remember that if only 6 people are chosen, if you have 3 people who are not chosen, you obviously know which 6 are chosen, or if you know which 6 are being chosen, you obviously know the 3 who are not chosen of the 9 people provided. Second, and quite importantly, regardless of the game, I highly recommend that you draw a picture showing a visual representation of the game. Back when I was in high school and university, whenever I took math courses, the professor would always say, draw a picture when you have a word problem, because it helps you visualize the problem. And I think that that is very, very applicable to the LSAT logic games sections. Thirdly, as I said at the start of this video, each game has a set of what are called major conditions. These conditions apply to any of the questions that are relating to the game, so I'd highly recommend that you draw out each of the major conditions. I also recommend that you develop your own shorthand to write them out in a very simple way that you can look at and understand very quickly. A bit of a pro tip on this one, when you're reading the game itself and the conditions, I recommend that you number each of the conditions. Let's say there's 5 conditions, number them from 1 to 5. Then, when you're writing them out, make sure that you have 5 conditions and also number those ones that you've written out 1 to 5. The reason being is that when you're rushing on an exam or you're stressed out because you're writing the exam, it's very easy to miss a condition. However, it's significantly less likely that you'll miss a condition if they're numbered and you follow that numerical system when you're drawing out those major conditions. Fourthly, I recommend that you make any inferences from those major conditions that you can and write down those inferences on the diagram you've drawn. So I recommend that when you're drawing that diagram, you have that diagram as like a master diagram. When you're doing the questions, you don't write on that diagram. You use that initial diagram you've drawn as kind of a master key to be able to answer your questions moving forward. So I recommend you put any inferences down on that diagram to help ensure that you don't forget any inferences, and those inferences are going to be extremely helpful when answering questions. Now, a lot of people, especially when they're starting out, won't take the time to do the inferences because people usually start with the easiest questions, which are generally one-dimensional sequencing games. However, I highly, highly, highly recommend that you get in the habit of doing inferences no matter how easy or how difficult your exam is. It's extremely helpful once you get used to doing inferences because oftentimes doing those inferences will answer many questions for you later on when you're doing those logic games. This is kind of similar to number 4, but I'm going to have it as another section. I recommend that you draw out or write in any definitive terms in your diagram. So what I mean by that is this. Let's say you're doing a sequencing game with 6 slots and letters A, B, C, D, E, and F. And let's say that game says that A has to be number 3 and that number 4 has to be B or C. Well, what I'd recommend is when you're drawing out your diagram, on number 3 you put A, and on number 4, you put B/C, showing you that A has to be in 3 and B or C have to be in 4. This is going to be very helpful for you when you're answering questions later on because you now know that 3 has to be A and that 4 either is B or C. So if you have a possible answer that suggests that there's something other than that, you know that that's not the right answer. Now, number 6, what I recommend you do is you answer the questions based on type rather than in numerical order. And what I mean by that is this. The first type of question you want to do is listing questions. Now, those are the questions you see where there's a string of possibilities set out. So you might have, for example, A, B, C, D, E, F, F, E, D, C, B, A, etc. Now, those ones are easier to answer because all you have to do is go through the conditions that you've already written out and see which potential answer breaks one of the conditions. As soon as it breaks a condition, you can cross that answer out, move on, and see which answer doesn't break any of the conditions. So that's the easiest one. The next one you will see that I recommend you do next are something called specific questions. And what specific questions do is they fill in one of the spots for the game itself. So if you have, let's say, you already know that, let's say A is in 3 and B or C is in 4. Let's say that there's a question that says, if D is in number 1, which of the following could be true? Well, by doing that, you essentially reduce the number of permutations and combinations you have to consider, because you now know D is 1, A is 3, and B and C are 4. By doing that, the questions actually made your job a lot easier. On average, reduce the amount of time you have to spend on the question so that you can then answer the question a lot quicker. So I recommend that you do the listing first and then any specific questions. Now, what I recommend you do third are any general questions. And what general questions are anything that are not listing specific, or what I'll explain as complex questions very shortly. General questions may be things like, which of the following must be true given the major conditions? Now, the thing that I recommend you leave for last and skip if you don't have enough time to do it is something called complex questions. Now, what a complex question essentially asks is that if you take away one of the major conditions, which of the answers would be logically equivalent? Now, as I'm sure you can guess, there are several different permutations and combinations for each of the answers. So to test that, it takes a lot of time. So I recommend that you do any complex questions at the end, or just guess if you don't have enough time. And number 6, and I don't recommend you necessarily rely on previous questions, but if you are really stuck, sometimes your answers in previous questions or some of the work you've done in previous sections can be used to reduce time or help you get the right answer on questions later on. I don't recommend you rely on this tip, but at the same time, if you are stuck and it's kind of a last resort, I think it isn't a bad idea to necessarily look back at your previous work and see if you can glean any answers from that. So before I sign off, I'm going to give you 2 general tips for how to approach the logic game section. Again, in future videos, I'm going to go in much more detail about each of the games and each of the questions, but for the sake of this video, I'll keep it general. The first thing is that when you're studying, logic games take time to learn. So when you're first starting out, don't worry about answering all 4 sections in 35 minutes like they require on the actual LSAT. Focus on accuracy first, and then focus on building up your speed. Also, I recommend learning good habits at the start. So when you're first studying, start learning to do inferences. Start making sure that you draw your diagram and write out the inferences before answering any questions. By learning the right steps and the right habits early on, it'll pay significant dividends later on when you're getting ready to write the exam. The second tip I have, and this is more when you're kind of getting ready to write the exam and getting ready to focus on optimizing your score, is that figure out which logic games you're best at and do those first. So for example, if you're best at linear games, or let's say in and out games, do those types of games first on the exam and leave the stuff you're not great at or that you're worried about till the end of the exam. That hopefully ensures that you're going to be able to get the quote-unquote easy marks first, and then if you run out of time, you're not giving up marks on a game that you absolutely could have gotten. I hope this video was helpful. If it was, I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the comments below. Thank you very much. Take care. See you next time.